Okay, we continue we're doing our Old Testament survey. We began the book of Genesis last week, and so if you have a note guide, we're on note guide N 2.1. And so for those of you that are just joining us this week with the note guide, N is for notes. The first number, the number 2, is for section 2 of this course. Section 2 is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And then that 2.11 is for Genesis. 2.2 will be for Exodus and so forth, just so you can follow the code. We see here the book of Genesis with the Hebrew title down there at the bottom, Bereshit. And that is Ba, which means in with or by, in, Rashit, in the beginning, in the top, in the head. And we talked about last week how long the Rashit was, how long the beginning was. And we looked at that word as it was used throughout Genesis and throughout the Old Testament, and came to the conclusion, I don't know if you can conclude that you're not really sure, but we saw that the Bible did not have a specific period of time that we could fix on for the beginning. And so a couple things that did come out that we can be absolutely sure about is that God created the world for the benefit of mankind, that mankind was his special creation. How do we know that we're special? Well, the Latin term is called the Imago Dei, and imago is image image of, and Dei is the Latin word for God, the image of God. And we know this is a famous painting by Michelangelo of God reaching down to mankind and touching mankind. In Genesis 1:27, it said, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God. Now, a couple things. That word created there are 2 verbs used in chapter 1 talking about what God did. And he used it in verse 1, in the beginning, God created. This word bara, which means created, has to do with cutting things out. And it is different than the word that is mainly used most of the time throughout the rest of this chapter. It said, and God asa, which means to do or to make something. And so the author is very intentional. Now, so he has some reason that he did not say bara, 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 bara. Usually when we think about Genesis chapter 1, we think about God creating ex nihilo, another Latin word, which means out of nothing. There was nothing, and God created things that are here, existence. And I believe that term bara gives that idea. Most of the time, after that first created, God asas, he makes things. And it is very debatable. I'm not giving a definitive final word on this. And if you ever hear me trying to do that, I've slipped off the edge. But I very much think that created means made ex nihilo, out of nothing. Wasn't there and now is. And when God asas in chapter 1, does or makes, that there is material there that he is changing and molding. Okay? I said last week, I believe verse 1, Genesis 1:1, is the whole creation story. It's a summary statement. In the beginning period of time, however long that was, God created everything that exists. The stars and the moons and the planets and all that. God created it. Who created it? God. And that is the introductory statement of the Bible. If that is true, keep reading. I'm going to tell you some more about God. If you do not believe that first verse, if you do not buy that God created everything, it's going to really impair your ability to understand anything you read after that in the Bible. if you do not have that starting point of God as the creator, the original, the uncreated, who created, then the stuff that comes after that is going to be less sensical to you. But I do believe that there is room in here for lots of debate about the process. I think, as I said last week, beginning in verse 2, we see the ordering of creation. Everything was created, not in a final form, but everything that is here was created in verse 1. And then in verse 2, man could not live there. It was ocean. The whole world was covered with water. And we see God bringing order for that special creation. And we see what that special creation again is in verse 27. So God created man. Adam is the word in Hebrew. He created humankind. He created people in his own image. That is, Father creating a child. In the image of God, he created him. And just so you don't mistake, because we're up until about 50 years ago, all languages, when you had the masculine was used when you're talking about a group of people, male and female, you would use a masculine term. We're in a feminist age, and feminism and all that stuff has affected our language. Our language always modifies with philosophy. And so now the language during your lifetime has shifted, and you have to specify that's a crowd of men and women. And so just so you don't make any mistake, when he said he created man in his own image, he was talking about everybody, humankind, male and female. But just so you don't miss it, in the third time it said male and female, he created them. That is everybody. That is a statement of that in the garden, with no sin, everybody was completely equal. Now, there was a difference between men and women, obviously. But there wasn't a priority, I believe, in the garden for man, male and female. And it was God. Why did God create mankind? You may want to take a stab at that? I mean, obviously because he wanted to. But why did he create? Well, according to the Bible, he created us. You were created because God had a desire to bless you. In the same way, why do we have children? We want to bless them. We want them to have a good life. We want them to grow up and enjoy the good of creation. That's an ancient compulsion that you have when you have kids. We all want the best for our kids, don't we? We want them to have better lives than us. That is a godly desire to bless. Then God blessed them. Does it say he blessed the man and said, take the woman with you, she'll be your helper and servant? No, he blessed them, saying to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. By that subduing, he means it is here for you. Now, subdue does not mean go and abuse the world, wreck it, try to own it for yourself and be vengeful and selfish and stockpile and, own all the land you can and all that. It doesn't mean that. It means it is here for your purposes. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves on the land. And God said, look, see, I have given you every herb that yields seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seeds. To you it shall be for food. And basically, in summary, he goes on, also every beast of the earth in which there is life I have given you for food, and it was so. In other words, I'm giving you all that you need for a healthy, abundant, consistent, contented life. The life you were created. My desire is to bless you. That's important. That's important. At this point, there is no work, there is no toil, there is no sweat of the brow to make your bread. Everything is meant to be beneficial and healthy and a blessing to us. What is God's intention for you? To be blessed. Why is life hard and unsatisfying at times? Because we are separated from that blessing. We are separated from that source of blessing. So rather than getting it inherently and naturally from the creation, we want to fight for it and wrestle for it and compete for it because the world is broken. One of my favorite things especially when you read it in Hebrew, the book of Joshua, they get back to the land and they're going into the promised land after so long, 400 years waiting to get into the promised land. And there's lots of little hints, especially in Hebrew, and you can see them in English, but less so, that they're going back into the Garden of Eden. You shall have vineyards that you did not plant, for example. But the thing is, sin has come into the world since they left the garden. And how did they get back in? They have to fight tooth and nail for every inch. Even though it's their possession and God has given it to them and it belongs to them, it don't matter. The world is now broken and you're going to have to scratch out and work by the toil of your brow to get to the blessings. And that's kind of the condition we're in, isn't it? I think we can all agree that being born again and living for God is a blessing. But is that blessing easy? Do we just wake up in the morning, feel our mouth filled with praise, and everything just rolls our way, and there's no mosquitoes or humidity, and there's a nice breeze, and everybody is nice to us, and I just want to scream about Jesus all day long everywhere I go? No. We have to pour energy in to wring the blessing out of life. That was not God's intention. And God saw that it was good. This is before sin. This is in the garden. God saw that it was good. What does that mean? Then God saw that everything he had made, there's that word saw, indeed, it was very good. What that means is it was for the benefit of man, for the blessing of man. Everything that God had given up to that point was for blessing. Now, was there more to creation? Is there more to creation than blessing? Well, we need to read on and see how things fall out. So what's the implication? The implication is God desires to bless mankind. That's my thought. If you want to fill out the my thoughts on yours, you are more than welcome to interpret that a different way. For me, Genesis 1 very much implies that God wishes to bless all of us. That's his great desire. Now, does that mean that it is God's desire to give everybody whatever they wish? No, because clearly, now that sin has entered, our desires are not necessarily what is a blessing to us. What is a drug addict's greatest desire?
Another fix.
To get that next high. Is that the best thing for that person? No. And so that's why, you hear me say all the time, God is not codependent. God is not going to enable us and help us do harmful things. God's desire is to bless us and give us what is healthy. What is healthy? Morality or immorality? Why in the end is immorality bad? Is it because it's fun and God doesn't want us to have fun? No, it is because immorality is unhealthy for the human being. We were not created for immorality, and it is harmful. It does us harm. And even if it doesn't do us physical harm, which most things we try to do, it does us spiritual harm. It drives us farther and farther away from God, who ultimately is the source of blessing. It drives a wedge into us. And even if we can achieve some level of contentment and happiness through wringing out, some fortunate few that can wring out of this awful world a little fun, a little consistent fun, that is a bad thing because they don't stop. They don't stop and think, do I need God? Because they can medicate themselves with activity, with fun activities. Jesus said, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. That's not because rich people are inherently evil. It's because they can medicate away the sufferings of this life better than a poor person. Blessed are the poor. Why? They have nothing but God to comfort them. A trip to the Swiss Alps and a good tasty meal, that can do wonders for the way you feel about things. And so it is good. It's okay for us to have things that comfort us unless those things begin to replace God. Because we were created to be blessed by God's presence, not by the stuff, the created stuff. We are made to interact with the Creator, not with the creation. I mean, we're made to interact with the creation, but only because it belongs to the Creator. But we do the opposite. We push God out, go away, and let me be here with my land or my cheeseburger or my alcohol or whatever it is that gives us some measure of comfort. Genesis chapter 2. This is talking about the Garden of Eden, and I want to walk you through a progression of sin here. We start out in Genesis chapter 2. We are in the Garden of Eden, but we will go from there all the way to Romans 1 tells us about people sliding away from God so far that they no longer feel guilt for doing immorality. He says their minds are dark and confused. So we want to just walk through that progression here. So back to Genesis chapter 2. Now, these are Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are creation from different angles. The first one is chapter 1 is focusing more on a cosmic angle and about God setting up things so that he can bless man there in the garden. Chapter 2 focuses more on the humans there in the garden. In chapter 2 verse 7, Yahweh God formed man, that is Adam, and I put that there in parentheses because there is wordplay going on that we miss in English sometimes. God formed man, Adam, from the dust of the ground. I've said it many times. That's atoms. We would say today that's atoms. We're all made from the same stuff. We're all made from the dust. Modern scientists would say we're carbon-based life forms. We're made from the atoms, the cosmic dust, if you will. He who is made from the dust of the ground. Now, the Hebrew word for ground is Adamah. And so that AH on the end of a Hebrew word, Adam is a masculine noun. Now, we don't have this in English. Spanish, French, those kind of things would be more familiar with this kind of thing. Then you take Adam and you put an AH on it, and it feminizes it and makes it a different word. Mankind is in a relationship here with the ground. We are made of the same stuff as the rest of creation. Our physical bodies are. And so on a fundamental level, the Bible says we are no different than a tree out there. Or a rock for that matter, what makes us different? And God blew into the man's nostrils the breath of life. Why do you exist? Because God wished for you to exist. And you live by the breath of God. There is no such thing as a permanent free agent from God. And man became a living being, and the word there for living being is a soul. And so again I say, Your soul is your spiritual quality, the breath of God, the Spirit of God within you that is unique to you. We all have the breath of life, the Spirit of God in us, but there are no other Rexes in existence. There's only me. I have an individual soul. And it is there in that soul where we have our responsibility. It is in our soul where before salvation we sin. We're born into a sin nature which taints our soul, darkens our soul, and that is the condition we find ourselves when we come to Christ. After salvation, the soul is regenerated. It is cleansed of sin. Now, we still walk in a body that has the effects of sin and the habit of sin on it, and that's why we struggle till our last breath. But if at any point you remove that physical body, you zap it, that soul goes to be with Jesus. Okay? And that's a hallelujah. But very much we see there are several metaphors we see going on here in chapter 1. That is relationships that is drawing. There's a food in that metaphor that you see. They have to eat in order to sin. But another one you see is the relationship between man and the ground. And at this point, we are made from the ground, and the difference between us and the ground is the breath of God. But we are in relationship. Now, where does the food come from? It comes from the Adamah. So the relationship between man and the ground is a metaphor for the relationship between God and man. Okay, so track that as we go. This is storytelling language. This is the way they used to communicate information. And so sometimes we miss it as modern people. Why did God create? What was the purpose of creating God? Yes, Danny? No? Okay. Genesis 2:15. Yahweh God took the man, and I am giving you my translations here that I've garnered from some very smart people. But what the Hebrew says, in your English translation, it generally says God placed man or put man in the garden. But the word there, the verb there, is a rare verb. And so when you see normal verbs, no big deal. But when you see a rare verb, you realize that the author is trying to say something. He's being intentional. And the verb there is noach. Does that sound familiar? God noached the man in the garden. Well, when you get over to in chapter 5 and they have the boy Noah, they say he named him Noah because he would be a comfort, a rest from all the sin. So a noach, we get the name Noah from it, is to rest. So was man put in the garden to work? That's what the English version of this verse. I'm giving you a different translation, what I believe the Hebrew text says and what it means. But in the English it says God put man in the garden to work and till the land. It's not what it says in Hebrew. It says he rested him in the garden for worship and obedience. Now we could go a long way, and I could give you the grammatical argument for that translation, and I could give you the thematic, but I stand behind this. In fact, when they did the New Living translation, not the Old Living Bible, but the New Living translation, they got to the editorial committee that was the Hebrew scholars, and they were unanimous in voting that this is the way the verse should be translated. Then they went up to the next, I've been told because one of my professors was on that committee, that it went up to the next stage, which was like a marketing committee. And they said, no, we're going to keep the old translation because old ladies won't buy the Bible. They won't think that it's a good version if it doesn't say what they're familiar with. That is the tail wagging the dog. And that was an economic. And I hate to give that ugliness about, but selling Bibles is a business. Anyway, God rested. And what's the implication of that? God resting man in the Garden of Eden and not putting him there to work. That it is supposed to be easy to interact with God. That's what we were created for. And we weren't created to struggle. and to sweat and to fight and to compete for everything. We weren't meant for God to be distant and difficult to hold on to. We weren't meant to have to struggle to know God's purpose for our life. We were meant to be blessed. And we were meant to worship God. Worship that's an English word. It comes from the Middle English worthship, which means to give something value, to give it worth. Worth. When you worship, you are giving something worth. We were rested in the garden, like you might rest your keys on the table, and to make God valuable and to seek to obey him in the way we live our lives. When you decide, should I go to Walmart or not? Then you think, does God have any problem with Walmart? I'm sure he has some problem with Walmart, but is it okay for me to go? Is it the right thing for me to do? Now, that seems laborious to a person that's never asked God, but what we are meant to do as believers is to walk in obedience. And that means develop the habit of saying, does this serve God's purposes for everything we do throughout the day? And that was a created purpose. And when you begin to do that, when you begin to seek God that way, it becomes very natural. And you know what? It becomes appropriate. And part of your purpose is to give God value and to obey him. I say as part, that is your purpose, and all the other things kind of come under that. Next verse says, and Yahweh God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, because God saw that it was good. It was put there. There's not limitations on you generally. God will provide. God was meant to provide. That's why in the New Testament it's such a big thing. Don't be greedy. Don't stockpile. God's desire is to look out for you. That is part of the intended blessing. Goes on, however, there is a warning, a caveat, that there are consequences. But you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. Dying, you will die. So there are limitations. Because without limitations, there's no responsibility. And so man was given responsibility to obey God. And they were given a limit. Now, so far, everything that has been given to man has been given to bless man. Everything is good. So is God withholding good from mankind? No. What is he withholding from mankind? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. God had shielded mankind from evil. And now is that what parents that love their children drop them off at the biker club and say, I want you to toughen up, kid. I'll pick you up in the morning? No. Did you have, when you had kids, an instinct to protect them from evil? And so people like to indict God that God is withholding, and that is certainly what the serpent will see. The serpent does is he told you that you'd drop dead. But God's intention is the intention of every loving parent, and that is to not expose their children to evil until they have the capacity to deal with it. And it is a loving thing. Mankind was innocent. In verse 25, the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. This is also where God gives marriage as an institution before sin. Before sin. Fundamental and foundational. We are meant to help one another. Men and women are different, and they are meant to be complements to one another. Women are good where men are not. Men are good where women are not. And that's a generalization, but that is the intention. They were innocent. They were naked and they felt no shame. Then we go from there to chapter 3. So that word naked, we've seen from our previous exercises. That was the one in the last verse in chapter 2. The first verse in chapter 3, which begins the fall of man, has the same term in it. The serpent's deceit in verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals. Just to refresh you, jump back to chapter 1 a minute. What was man's relationship with animals relative to animals? Was man made equal to animals in chapter 1?
Superior.
You are to be above the animals. And so it is very important that he mentions wild animals. It's the same term that in chapter 1 man was given dominion over. So does the woman have to listen to the serpent? No. And I tend to think wild animal also is talking about beastly natures. That nature, anyway, all the animal natures, I don't want to go into detail about it. He said to the woman, now it said that, again, if you weren't here, that word crafty there is from the same root word as the word naked in the previous verse. It is the appearance of honesty, the appearance of openness, but he is withholding. He uses a series of true statements to weave a lie. He said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Just a little bit about the serpent. Always in all ancient cultures, serpents were a symbol of evil. And so, and I think still we get that the serpent is meant to be evil. But in all ancient cultures, they would have sea monsters and serpents that were symbols of evil. Chaotic evil. That means they want to mess up the order of things and they want to be against people. They are struggling against people in blessing. The opposite of God's desire to bless us with the good is the serpent's desire to mess it up. They do that by creating chaos. So there's a big thing. Ancient people were very big on the order of things in the seasons. They needed it to rain in spring so the crops would come up and they could live. They needed to get cold and so forth. And the opposite of that is chaos, when it is hot in the winter and cold in the summer and it rains more than it should or it doesn't rain at all. Chaos is evil. Beast of the field, I've already talked about that. They are given dominion over that and over their natures, and they forfeit that, as we will see. Genesis 1:28, subdue the land, have dominion over every living thing that moves on it. God gave mankind the right to say no to the serpent. Could man have refused the serpent? It's kind of a moot point because we did not. But it seems to me, reading the scriptures and kind of following, connecting the dots, that man was meant to refuse the serpent and say, no, we're going to stay with God. It'd have been a much shorter Bible if they had that. So here comes sin. Chapter 3, verses 6 and 7. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable to make one for gaining wisdom. So that saw there I highlighted, God saw that it was good. So it was a godlike quality for her to evaluate the blessing. And that the tree was good. God saw that it was good. Pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom. Wisdom is a godlike quality. She took some and ate it. Okay? She gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes, again, God is the one who sees. The eyes of both of them were opened. And they were like God. They were looking at the bigger picture of things, and they realized that they were naked. That is a third different use of that word, a different form in Hebrew. This form is used in Deuteronomy 28:48, I believe, for saying they were naked and taken away in judgment. And so this third different form of naked, is they were under God's judgment. They realized that they were responsible for their actions. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. I very much interpret this to be man coming up with religion. Man creating religions to make themselves acceptable to God. And when we have messed up as Christians, it's when we reduce the Christian faith to a religion. Punch the clock, do the tasks that make you a good religious person, and then go home and do whatever you want with your heart. That is a lie of the devil. That is us trying to cover ourselves with fig leaves. We cannot make ourselves acceptable to God. We are naked before God. We are naked before the judgment of God. It is only seeking forgiveness in the way that He prescribes to us to seek forgiveness that we have any hope of forgiveness and being acceptable to God. So just a quick question. Who sinned first?
Eve.
You think Eve? How many think Eve? Okay, the two men think Eve. Who disagrees? Who thinks that Adam sinned first?
He went with her, right?
He went with her. Now, over in the book of Hebrews, I believe it's Hebrews, it says that the woman was deceived. She was buying into what the serpent was saying. But the man was not deceived. So what's the implication of that? Did he know what the serpent was trying to do?
He wasn't deceived.
If he wasn't deceived, so he was standing there taking everything in. Did he know that they were messing up? If he wasn't deceived, he knew.
Yep.
What did he do about it?
He-
Nothing. All right? My case is that they sinned at the same time in different ways. Eve committed a sin. She committed a sin by disobeying God. She believed a lie, and then she took that lie and she was disobedient. But is Adam not responsible? He knew what was going on.
Listen,
If you know your wife is about to sin and you do nothing, as a husband, you have no responsibility. Adam sinned. He sinned by omission, by not acting to prevent sin. The intention, I think, of the Bible author who was inspired by God, Adam needed to say, whoa, babe, hold up. Let's stay with God. Let's stay with God. Let's not listen to this snake. And he did not. Passivity. If we think today about the problem in churches, one of the problems in churches, what is it? It's the passivity of the men. Have you ever been in a church where the men worked harder than the women? Ever? I haven't been. Men are passive, and excuse me to the men who are not passive. But in general, one of the big problems in the Christian faith is that the men are passive and the women carry the water for the churches. And that was what it said in the first story in the Bible, is that men have a tendency to be passive. Also, we don't want to disagree with our wife in public and get yelled at when we get home, but that's all to the side, not part of this story. Many men would rather face an angry God than an angry wife, but that's not the author's intention. I think that's a good place to stop for this week. We will pick up there, and maybe we'll make it to Exodus next week. We're not in a hurry. Any questions or comments? All right, well, let's stop right there.